The message arrived at 6:14 in the morning. I read it twice before I put my phone down. We need some distance for a while. That was all my son had written before adding that his wife had already packed a few boxes for me. By the time I walked into the guest room, my clothes were folded into cardboard cartons that had not been there the night before. No one raised their voice. No one explained anything. They moved around me as if the decision had already become history. I nodded once, thanked them for breakfast, and quietly made one phone call before leaving the house. They never asked what that call was about. People often mistake quiet for weakness. I learned years ago that the loudest person in a room rarely carried the heaviest burden. So I kept my thoughts to myself, finished what needed to be done, and never expected applause for ordinary responsibilities. That habit followed me through 42 years of work, through the loss of my wife, and into retirement. When my son asked me to move in with him after I sold my house, I believed it was because we both understood what family meant. He said the extra space would be good for everyone. He said the grandchildren deserved to know their grandfather. He said I should not spend my retirement alone. I believed every word because he had never given me a reason not to. Their house was comfortable without being extravagant. My room overlooked a small backyard where the maple tree changed colors every autumn. Every morning I woke before anyone else. I made coffee, read the newspaper from beginning to end, and watered the plants that lined the fence. It became such a regular routine that the neighbors began waving before they even reached their driveways. Those quiet mornings belonged to me. The rest of the house belonged to a younger family finding its rhythm. I tried not to interrupt that rhythm. If the children needed help with homework, I was there. If my son worked late, dinner stayed warm until he arrived. If my daughter-in-law looked tired after work, I quietly loaded the dishwasher before she noticed. None of those things felt like sacrifices. They were simply ways of sharing a home. Money was treated the same way. After retiring, I received a reliable pension every month. Years of careful planning meant I never worried about paying my own bills. Living with my son's family also meant my expenses were smaller than they had once been. One evening, shortly after moving in, I noticed my son studying the kitchen table with a calculator. Mortgage papers, utility bills, insurance statements. He looked exhausted. He laughed when he saw me watching. "Everything keeps getting more expensive," I nodded. "It always does." That was the end of the conversation. The following week, I visited my bank. I arranged several automatic direct deposits. One payment went toward the mortgage. Another covered the electric bill. Another handled the homeowner's insurance. A few smaller transfers helped with groceries and internet service. The payments happened automatically every month. No reminders, no discussions, no ceremonies. I never considered it charity. This was my family. Family helps before someone has to ask. I never told my son the exact amounts. He thanked me occasionally for helping around the house, and I simply smiled. The details did not matter to me. I had spent my entire life believing that generosity became smaller the moment it demanded recognition. My daughter-in-law thanked me differently. She preferred efficiency. "If you're buying groceries," she would say, "could you pick up milk too? If you're already going out, could you take the kids to practice? If you're paying your share of the utilities, I'll handle dinner tonight." She always sounded polite, organized, practical. Nothing she said was openly disrespectful. Still, I sometimes noticed that she spoke about the household as though every responsibility naturally belonged to someone else. She liked everything scheduled, everything categorized, everything under control. I admired that about her. At least I tried to. Whenever relatives visited, she introduced me warmly. "This is Dad, he's staying with us." The words were harmless, yet every time I heard them, something felt unfinished. Staying, not living, not sharing, just staying. I dismissed the feeling. Words can mean different things to different people. There was no reason to read too much into them. My son seemed happy. That was enough. On weekends, we grilled in the backyard while the grandchildren chased each other through the grass. Sometimes my son asked about my years at work. Other times we watched baseball without saying much at all. Those were my favorite moments. Silence shared between people who trust each other never feels empty. It feels earned. I believed we still had that kind of silence. As months became years, routines settled deeper into the house. The mortgage payment left my account every month. The utility companies received their transfers. Insurance premiums renewed automatically. I rarely checked the confirmations anymore because nothing ever changed. The system worked exactly as it had been designed to. Quietly, reliably, invisible. Perhaps that was the problem. Invisible things are easy to forget. People grow accustomed to lights turning on when they flip a switch. They stop wondering how the electricity gets paid. Water comes from the faucet. The internet works. The mortgage stays current. Life continues without interruption. No one pauses to ask why. I never wanted anyone to. Looking back now, I understand that silence has a strange effect on people. The longer they benefit from it, the more ordinary it seems. Eventually, they stop seeing it as generosity. They begin seeing it as the natural order of things. And once that happens, gratitude quietly disappears without anyone noticing the day it left. The first changes were so small that I convinced myself they were nothing. Families change, children grow older, work becomes more demanding, people become tired without realizing it. I had lived long enough to know that not every silence meant something was wrong. So I ignored the feeling. It started with conversations ending a little too quickly. I would walk into the kitchen after finishing my morning walk, and the room would become strangely quiet. My son would be looking down at his coffee. My daughter-in-law would suddenly remember something upstairs. Within seconds, everyone had found a reason to leave. I told myself they had simply finished talking, nothing more. One evening, I came home from the grocery store carrying 2 bags. My granddaughter ran to help me. Before she reached the door, her mother gently called her back. "Let Grandpa do it. He likes staying busy." The words sounded harmless, even thoughtful, but I noticed my granddaughter hesitate. She looked at me as though she wasn't sure whether helping me would somehow be doing something wrong. I smiled anyway. "I've carried heavier bags than these," she smiled back. Children always accept the explanation adults give them. Adults are not always as honest. As autumn arrived, the household began making decisions without mentioning them until afterward. The living room furniture disappeared one Saturday while I was visiting the library. When I returned, a delivery crew was assembling new furniture. "It was on sale," my daughter-in-law explained. "It looks nice. It cost more than we expected, but we'll make it work." I nodded. No one had done anything wrong. It simply surprised me. For years, we had discussed almost every household expense over dinner, not because anyone needed permission, because that was how families respected one another. Now I was learning about changes only after they had already happened. Again, I told myself not to overthink it. Young couples deserve independence. I repeated those words often, mostly to myself. My son's schedule became harder to predict. Sometimes he came home late without calling. Sometimes he spent entire evenings answering emails from his office. Whenever I tried asking how work was going, his answers became shorter. "Busy. Same as always. Nothing new." He wasn't rude, just distant. I wondered whether he was carrying pressures he didn't want to discuss. I remembered being his age. There were years when I had protected my own family from worries they never needed to carry. Perhaps he was doing the same. Meanwhile, my daughter-in-law slowly became the voice of the household. If I asked whether everyone would be home for dinner, she answered before my son could speak. If I asked about weekend plans, she already knew the schedule. If relatives called, she explained everyone's availability. At first, I admired how organized she was. Later, I began noticing something else. My son rarely corrected her. He simply nodded. One afternoon, I overheard them discussing next summer. "We'll probably convert the guest room into an office." The sentence caught my attention. Guest room. I looked toward the hallway. The room they were describing was mine. When they noticed me standing nearby, my daughter-in-law smiled naturally. "Oh, not any time soon," I smiled back. "No hurry." The conversation ended there. Still, that single phrase stayed with me much longer than it should have. Guest room. I reminded myself that technically it had once been exactly that. Words matter less than actions, I thought, and their actions had always welcomed me. Hadn't they? The grandchildren remained unchanged. They still knocked on my door before bedtime. They still asked me to tell the same stories they had already memorized. They still left drawings on my dresser. Children rarely hide affection. That gave me comfort, but even they began saying things that sounded borrowed. One evening my grandson asked, "Grandpa, when are you getting your own place again?" I looked at him. "What makes you ask that?" He shrugged. "I don't know." Then he returned to building his puzzle. Children often repeat what they hear without understanding it. Adults understand more than they admit. That night I lay awake longer than usual, not because of what he had asked, because of where the question must have come from. Over the following weeks, invitations quietly changed. Family dinners became dinners after I had already eaten. Weekend outings were mentioned only when everyone returned home carrying shopping bags. Photographs appeared online from gatherings I never knew were happening. Whenever I noticed, someone always had an explanation. "We thought you were resting. You seemed tired. It happened at the last minute." Every explanation sounded reasonable by itself. None of them proved anything, yet together they formed something difficult to ignore, not evidence, not yet, only a feeling. And feelings are easy to dismiss when you have spent an entire lifetime believing the best about the people you love. So I continued my routines. I watered the plants. I paid quiet attention to the grandchildren. I watched the mortgage payment leave my account every month without giving it another thought. I kept telling myself that families simply pass through difficult seasons. If I stayed patient, this season would pass too. I did not know then that what I believed was temporary had already begun becoming permanent. Chapter 3, First Red Flags Approx. 780 words. I have never believed that trust disappears all at once. It leaves quietly. First, it asks questions. Then it notices patterns. Only much later does it admit that the answers no longer make sense. That was where I found myself. Not angry, not suspicious by nature. Simply paying closer attention than I had before. The first thing I noticed was my mail. For years, the routine had never changed. The mail carrier placed everything through the slot beside the front door. If I happened to be outside, I picked it up. If not, someone left it on the small table in the hallway until I collected it after breakfast. Then, without anyone mentioning it, that routine disappeared. One afternoon, I was expecting a statement from my bank. It did not arrive. At least I thought it had not. 3 days later, while taking out the recycling, I noticed a torn envelope with my name on it folded inside a cardboard box. It had already been opened. I stood there for several seconds. Perhaps someone had mistaken it for another letter. Perhaps it had been opened accidentally. Accidents happen. I carried the envelope inside without saying anything. That evening, I asked my daughter-in-law if she had seen my bank statement. She smiled politely. "Oh, yes, it came a few days ago. I thought I left it on the counter. I never saw it. I'm sorry, I must have forgotten." She sounded sincere. I accepted the explanation. Still, I began checking the mailbox myself whenever I returned from my morning walk. Sometimes there was nothing. Sometimes there were letters already stacked neatly on the hallway table. Sometimes there was only mail addressed to everyone else. It became impossible to know whether I was seeing everything that had arrived. Again, I said nothing. Silence often reveals more than confrontation. A week later, my phone buzzed with a banking notification. One of my automatic transfers had been processed later than usual. The payment still went through. Nothing had failed. It simply happened 2 days after the normal date. I logged into my account that evening. Everything appeared correct. The mortgage transfer, the utility payments, insurance, internet. Each one still left my account exactly as scheduled. The delay seemed minor. Even so, I printed the transaction history and slipped it into a folder inside my desk. Not because I expected trouble, because records have a better memory than people. Around that same time, I noticed changes in the way my daughter-in-law described the house. When neighbors stopped by, she would proudly say, "We've done a lot to our home." Our home. There was nothing wrong with that. It was her home. Then she would add, almost as an afterthought, "Dad's staying with us for now." For now. The words were light, casual, almost invisible, but they landed differently every time I heard them. No one corrected her, least of all my son. He stood beside her with the comfortable silence of someone who had stopped noticing the language altogether. I wondered whether he realized how those small phrases slowly changed the shape of a person's place within a family. You stop being part of the foundation. You become temporary, replaceable. A visitor who happened to stay longer than expected. I kept those thoughts to myself. One evening I asked my son if he wanted to have coffee after dinner, just the two of us, like we used to. He glanced toward his wife before answering. "Maybe another night." "Of course." That other night never came. Instead, our conversations became text messages sent from opposite ends of the same house. "Running late. Dinner was good. Don't wait up." Sometimes I laughed quietly at the absurdity of it. A father and son living under one roof, communicating through screens more often than spoken words. Technology had made conversation easier. Somehow it had also made distance easier. The grandchildren noticed less than I did. Or perhaps they noticed more and simply lacked the words to explain it. One Saturday, my granddaughter asked if I wanted to come to her school recital. "I'd love to," she smiled. Before we could say anything else, my daughter-in-law answered from across the room. "We already gave away the extra tickets." My granddaughter looked confused. "I thought Grandpa was coming." "So did I said gently. "It's all right." She hugged me anyway. Children have a way of apologizing for things they did not cause. Adults rarely do. That night I opened the folder in my desk again. Not because I wanted evidence against anyone, because something inside me had quietly changed. For the first time, I stopped assuming every uncomfortable moment was an accident. One missed letter could be forgotten. One delayed conversation could be explained. One invitation could genuinely be overlooked. But when every small event leaned in the same direction, it no longer felt random. It felt organized, not openly, not dramatically. Just enough to move me one careful step farther from the center of a family I had once believed would always have room for me. I closed the folder and returned it to the drawer. I still hoped I was wrong. Hope, I had learned, is often the last thing to leave. Even after trust has already begun packing its bags, there is a kind of loneliness that exists even when a house is full. It arrives quietly. You hear laughter from another room, but no one calls your name. Plans are made around you instead of with you. Questions receive answers that explain everything except what you actually asked. I found myself living inside that kind of loneliness. At first, I believed I could fix it by being more careful. I spoke less. I stayed out of the kitchen when dinner was being prepared. I watched television with the volume turned low. If the children were busy, I returned to my room without asking if they wanted company. I convinced myself that giving everyone more space would somehow bring us closer again. Instead, I seemed to disappear even faster. One evening, I noticed that the monthly utility bill was higher than usual. I mentioned it casually during dinner. "Winter always makes heating expensive." My son nodded without looking up from his plate. Before he could say anything else, his wife smiled. "We're managing." "I know," I said. I was only making conversation. "We don't want you worrying about household finances." The sentence sounded considerate, almost protective, but something about it unsettled me. For years, I had quietly helped carry those finances. Now I was being told they were none of my concern. I simply nodded. "I understand." The conversation moved on. Mine did not. A few days later, I asked whether the mortgage company had changed its payment schedule. It was an ordinary question. I had noticed the processing dates shifting slightly on my account. My daughter-in-law laughed softly. You still keep track of things like that? I've always kept records. You don't have to anymore. There was nothing cruel in her voice, nothing loud, just certainty, as though my role in the household had already ended and no one had remembered to tell me. My son finally looked up. Dad, you've earned the right to relax. I am relaxed. So let us handle everything. I smiled. I thought we already were. Neither of them answered. The silence that followed was heavier than the conversation itself. From then on, every simple question seemed to become proof that I was somehow creating problems. If I asked what time everyone expected to be home, I was told I worried too much. If I offered to cook dinner, someone had already ordered takeout. If I mentioned repairing the loose gate in the backyard, I was told it could wait. Slowly, I stopped offering. Not because I had lost interest, because every attempt to participate ended the same way. One Saturday, my sister called. She asked how retirement was treating me. Before I could answer, my daughter-in-law walked into the room carrying laundry. She smiled warmly. "Oh, he's doing great. We keep telling him to stop trying to run the house." She laughed. My sister laughed politely. I forced myself to do the same. After the call ended, I sat alone for a long time. I tried to remember when concern had become control, when experience had become interference. I could not find the day it happened. Only the feeling that everyone else had accepted a version of me I no longer recognized. A week later, my son finally spoke to me directly. "Dad, Sarah feels like you're having trouble letting us make our own decisions." I looked at him carefully. "What decisions?" "Just household things. I haven't objected to anything." "I know." "Then why does she feel that way?" He rubbed his forehead before answering. "It's not about what you say." "What is it about?" "It's the way you ask." I waited. He seemed to expect me to understand. I didn't. "I ask because I live here," he sighed. "Sometimes it feels like you're checking up on us." The words settled heavily between us, checking up on us. I had spent years trusting my son completely. Now ordinary conversation had somehow become suspicion. "I've never checked up on you." "I know you don't mean to." That sentence stayed with me. "I know you don't mean to." It dismissed my intentions while still holding me responsible for feelings I could neither control nor understand. It was impossible to defend myself against something so vague. That night I replayed every conversation in my mind. Had I asked too many questions? Had I offered too much advice? I searched my own memory before questioning anyone else's. That is what quiet people often do. We assume the fault may be ours before looking elsewhere. For several days, I spoke only when spoken to. The house became noticeably calmer, not happier, just quieter. No one seemed to notice that I had withdrawn, or perhaps they noticed and preferred it. Then came the family dinner that changed something inside me. Several relatives visited for my grandson's birthday. Someone asked how everyone was adjusting to living together. Before I could answer, my daughter-in-law smiled. "We're helping Dad become more independent." The table nodded approvingly. Someone even said, "That's good. Retirement can make people cling to family." No one looked at me. No one asked whether that description was true. They accepted it because it fit the story they had already been given. I took a sip of water, finished my meal, complimented the birthday cake, helped clean the dishes. Not once did I correct anyone. Truth does not become stronger because it is spoken louder. Sometimes it simply waits. I returned to my room that evening and opened the folder inside my desk. The payment records were still there, the bank confirmations, the transfer history, the dates, the amounts, the quiet evidence of a life lived through responsibility rather than recognition. For the first time, I realized something that left me colder than any accusation. They did not see me as someone who had carried part of the family's foundation. They saw me as someone they had been carrying. And once people begin believing that version of the story, every act of kindness you once gave them is slowly rewritten as something they believe they gave to you. I did not decide to look for proof. Proof found me. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of day that disappears from memory because nothing remarkable is supposed to happen. I drove to my bank after breakfast because I wanted to replace a debit card that had begun sticking in store terminals. It was a simple errand. I expected to be home before lunch. The branch manager recognized me before I reached the counter. We had known each other for years, not socially. Just through the quiet familiarity that develops when someone has handled your accounts long enough to recognize your face without checking your identification. "Good morning," she said. "How can we help today?" I explained the problem with my card. She smiled. "That will only take a few minutes." While another employee prepared the replacement, she glanced at my account history on her screen. "You've kept those recurring transfers active for quite a long time." I nodded. "They've become part of the routine. They're certainly reliable." There was nothing unusual about the conversation until she asked the question that changed everything. "Would you like to review the scheduled transfers while you're here? We encourage customers to check them from time to time." I almost declined. Then I heard myself say, "Yes." She turned the monitor slightly so I could read it. One line after another filled the screen: mortgage payment, electric utility, water service, homeowner's insurance, internet provider, a monthly transfer labeled household support. Each payment had been processed automatically, month after month, year after year, no interruptions, no missed dates. The history stretched farther back than I expected. I had become so accustomed to the system that I had stopped seeing it. Now displayed in careful rows with dates and confirmation numbers, it looked different. It looked substantial. The branch manager noticed me studying the screen. "Everything appears to be working correctly." "It does. You've never missed a payment," I smiled faintly. "I suppose I haven't." She printed the transaction summary and placed it neatly inside a folder. "Always good to keep your records current." I thanked her. She had no idea she had handed me something much larger than paperwork. She had handed me perspective. On the drive home, I kept thinking about recent conversations. "We're managing. We don't want you worrying. We'll handle everything." Those sentences echoed differently now, not because anyone had lied about the bills being paid. They were being paid. The records proved that. The question was much simpler. Did they understand who had been paying them? When I arrived home, the kitchen was empty. I placed the folder inside my desk without opening it again. I wasn't building a case against anyone. I was trying to understand my own place inside the story that seemed to be changing around me. Over the next several days, more small pieces began fitting together. One afternoon, the mail carrier stopped me while I was trimming the hedges. "Thought I'd mention it," he said. "I've been leaving some of your financial mail directly with your daughter-in-law lately when she meets me at the door." He shrugged. "Figured it was easier." I thanked him. He walked away without realizing what he had confirmed. He had no reason to suspect anything unusual. Families collect one another's mail every day. Still, another quiet detail had settled into place. A week later, I received an email from the insurance company confirming the annual premium had renewed successfully. Out of curiosity, I logged into the account. Every payment had originated from my bank. Every renewal notice listed me as the paying account holder. Nothing had changed, nothing except the way I now looked at it. The following Friday, I needed a copy of a property tax document for my personal records. Rather than searching online, I visited the county office. The clerk printed the recent payment history. As she slid the pages across the counter, she smiled politely. "Everything is completely current. I try to stay organized. It certainly shows." Again, she was only doing her job. Another neutral witness, another official record, no emotion, no opinion, just facts. That evening, my grandson sat beside me while drawing pictures at the dining room table. Without looking up, he asked, "Grandpa, do houses stop being yours if you don't pay for them anymore?" I looked at him carefully. "Why do you ask?" He shrugged. "I heard Mom say people have to earn their place." Children rarely understand the weight of the words they repeat. Adults often forget they are listening. I smiled gently. "People earn trust in many different ways." He nodded, satisfied with the answer, and returned to his drawing. I remained where I was long after he left the room, not because of what he had said, because I finally understood the story being told inside the house. It was not that I had become older, or quieter, or less useful. It was that my presence had gradually been rewritten. The man who quietly shared responsibility had become, in someone else's version of events, the man being supported. The records resting inside my desk told a different story. They did not argue, they did not accuse. They simply existed: dates, amounts, confirmation numbers, automatic deposits leaving my account with the same steady rhythm they always had. For years, those invisible transactions had allowed everyone to believe life simply worked. The lights came on, the mortgage stayed current, the insurance never lapsed. No one asked why, because the system never demanded attention. I closed the folder once more. For the first time since moving into my son's home, I realized that the strongest witness I had was not my memory. It was the quiet record of every promise I had kept without ever asking to be thanked. And somewhere deep inside me, another realization settled just as quietly. If those payments ever stopped, the truth would no longer be something I needed to explain. It would explain itself. The text message arrived 3 weeks later. I had just finished watering the flowers along the back fence when my phone vibrated in my pocket. I wiped my hands on a towel before looking at the screen. It was from my son. "Dad, we think everyone needs some distance for a while. Sarah has packed your things. It would probably be best if you found another place to stay. We can talk later." I read it once, then again. The words did not change. I looked toward the kitchen window. My son was standing inside. For a brief moment, our eyes met. He looked away first. I walked into the house without raising my voice. The hallway was quiet. The children were at school. My daughter-in-law was sealing cardboard boxes with brown packing tape. My sweaters were already folded. My books were stacked carefully. Even the framed photograph of my late wife had been wrapped in newspaper. She looked up when I entered. "We thought it would make things easier." I nodded. "I see." No apology, no anger. Just two people standing in the same room, living entirely different versions of the same day. I carried one box to my car, then another. My son never came outside. When everything had been loaded, I returned to the front door. "I hope things work out for all of you." My daughter-in-law offered a polite smile. "I'm sure they will." I believed she meant it. At that moment, she truly thought they would. I drove away without looking in the rearview mirror. There was nothing left to see. I rented a small apartment across town. 1 bedroom, a narrow balcony, a kitchen barely large enough for one person. It was quiet, not the heavy silence I had lived with during my final months in my son's house. A different kind of quiet, the kind that asks nothing from you. The first evening, I unpacked only the essentials: a kettle, a lamp, the photograph of my wife. The folder containing years of payment records rested beside them on the table. The next morning, I made coffee before sunrise. Old habits survive difficult endings. After breakfast, I drove to my bank. The same branch manager greeted me warmly. "Everything all right?" "Yes. What can we do for you today?" "I need to make some changes." She opened my account. I handed her a list I had written the night before: mortgage transfer, canceled; electric utility transfer, canceled; water service, canceled; insurance premium, canceled; internet payment, canceled; household support transfer, canceled. She reviewed the list carefully. "Would you like these changes to take effect immediately?" "Yes." She looked at me for a moment, not curiously, respectfully. "As you wish." There were no dramatic signatures, no emotional speeches, just electronic confirmations appearing one after another on her screen. Each recurring payment disappeared from the schedule. The entire process took less than 10 minutes. Years of quiet support ended with a few careful keystrokes. When she handed me the confirmation printout, she simply said, "Everything has been updated." I thanked her and left. No one in my son's house knew what had happened. There was no reason they would. Automatic systems rarely announce when they stop. They simply stop. The first week passed peacefully. I settled into my apartment. I found a nearby grocery store. I introduced myself to an elderly neighbor who spent every afternoon reading on the shared patio. Life became smaller. Strangely, it also became lighter. Then my phone rang. It was my son. I answered. Dad. Hello. I wanted to check how you're doing. I'm settling in. There was a pause. That's good. Another pause. Then his voice changed. Listen, have you noticed anything unusual with your bank? No, our mortgage payment didn't go through. I remained silent. They said the automatic transfer wasn't there. I see. We thought maybe it was a banking error. It wasn't. Silence filled the line. Not uncomfortable, simply unavoidable. You canceled it. Yes, another long pause, but why? I looked out the apartment window before answering. Because I no longer live there. He did not respond immediately. I didn't think. His sentence faded away. No, I said quietly. I don't believe you did. Neither of us raised our voices. Neither of us argued. We ended the call a few minutes later without solving anything. The overdue notices began arriving exactly as the payment schedules predicted they would. The mortgage company sent a reminder, then the utility provider. Then the insurance company requested updated payment information before the next renewal date. None of those organizations knew anything about family disagreements. They dealt only with records, accounts, due dates, confirmation numbers. Systems have no interest in emotion. They simply reflect reality. A few days later, my daughter-in-law called. Her voice was calm at first. We've been trying to understand what's happening. I imagine you have. The electric company says the automatic payment ended. Yes, was that intentional? It was. You could have warned us. I thought about that. Then I answered honestly. I learned I was leaving the house from a text message after my belongings had already been packed. She said nothing. For several seconds, all I heard was her breathing. Finally, she spoke again. We assumed. She stopped. I waited. We assumed those payments were just part of the household. They were. But households change. She had no answer. The conversation ended politely. No accusations, no insults, only silence. Within another month, the strain began showing in ways no one could ignore. My son accepted extra overtime. Weekend trips disappeared. The new furniture they had proudly purchased was quietly listed for sale. The children no longer attended every extracurricular activity because expenses had to be reconsidered. Relatives who had once admired how well everything seemed to be managed began asking careful questions. No one accused anyone. They simply wondered why so many financial problems had appeared so suddenly. No one knew the answer, except me, and the bank records resting inside my desk. I never called to explain. I never sent copies of the transfers. I never defended myself. The truth had finally reached the point where it no longer needed my voice. It had begun speaking through consequences, and consequences, unlike arguments, are impossible to interrupt. People imagine that the hardest part of betrayal is the moment it happens. It is not. The hardest part comes later when you finally stop waiting for someone to admit what they have done. For weeks after leaving my son's house, I kept expecting a different kind of phone call. Not one about mortgage payments. Not one about utility bills. Not one asking whether a transfer had been canceled by mistake. I expected to hear my son say 4 simple words. Dad, I'm sorry. They never came. Instead, every conversation circled back to money. It happened so gradually that I almost missed it. The first call was about the mortgage. The second was about the insurance policy. The third was about the electric company. Each conversation began with concern for me. Each conversation ended with concern for the accounts. The pattern became impossible to ignore. One afternoon, my son asked if we could meet for coffee. I agreed. We chose a small diner halfway between our homes. It was the kind of place where retired couples lingered over breakfast and waitresses remembered everyone's usual order. He arrived 10 minutes late. He looked older than I remembered. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes. His shirt was neatly pressed, but there was a tiredness in the way he carried himself that no amount of ironing could remove. For a moment, all I saw was my little boy, the child who used to wait by the window for me to come home from work, the teenager who asked me to teach him how to drive, The young man who cried at his mother's funeral because he believed he had to be strong for everyone else. Love does not disappear because trust has been damaged. Sometimes that is what makes betrayal hurt so deeply. He sat across from me. We ordered coffee. Neither of us reached for the menus. Finally, he spoke. "We're having a hard time," I nodded once. "I know. The bills keep piling up." "I imagine they do." He looked down into his coffee. "I didn't realize—" Again, he stopped before finishing the sentence. "You didn't realize what? How much you were covering." There it was, not an apology, a realization. There is a difference. "I never hid it," I said quietly. "I just never talked about it." He rubbed his forehead. "Sarah thought—" He stopped again. "What did Sarah think?" "She thought you were contributing a little." I smiled sadly. "I was." His eyes met mine. "You know what I mean." "I do." Silence settled between us, not angry, just honest. After several minutes, he asked the question I had been expecting since the day I left. "Could you start the transfers again?" He asked it carefully, almost gently, as though the request itself might somehow repair everything that had happened before it. I looked at him for a long time before answering. "When your message told me you needed distance, I believed you." He lowered his eyes. "You packed my life into boxes before asking me a single question." "I know. You decided I no longer belonged in your home. We were under pressure." "I don't doubt that." He looked up hopefully. "But pressure doesn't explain why I learned I was leaving through a text message." He had no answer. Neither of us raised our voices. The waitress refilled our coffee cups without interrupting. Life continued around us. Forks touched plates. People laughed quietly at nearby tables. The world did not pause because one family had finally begun facing its own reflection. "I never wanted your money," he said. "I know. You became accustomed to it." He closed his eyes for a moment. "Yes." There was something painfully honest about hearing him admit it. Not because it erased the past, because it finally described it accurately. People rarely notice quiet generosity while it is happening. They notice only the silence it leaves behind. He reached across the table, not far enough to touch my hand, just far enough to remind me that once, years ago, he would have. "I don't know how we got here." "I do." He waited. "We stopped talking to each other honestly." He nodded. "And I helped create that." I looked at him with genuine surprise. "You did." "I should have asked questions." He took a slow breath. "I let Sarah answer them instead." Those words hurt more than anything else he had said, because they were true, not because they blamed her, because they acknowledged his own absence. For years I had believed I was slowly losing my son. Now I realized something different. He had quietly stepped away long before I noticed. We finished our coffee. When the check arrived, I reached for it out of habit. He stopped me. "I've got this." For the first time in many years, I let him pay, not because I couldn't afford it, because some responsibilities have to return to the people who left them behind. Outside the diner, we stood beside our cars. He looked as though he wanted to say something else. Perhaps he did. Instead, he asked, "Will things ever be the same again?" I answered with complete honesty. "I don't know." He nodded slowly. Neither of us pretended otherwise. I drove home alone. There was no feeling of victory. No satisfaction, only a quiet understanding that some losses cannot be measured by bank statements or overdue notices. The greatest loss had happened long before the payment stopped. It happened the day my son began believing I was someone his family carried. Instead of remembering that for years we had been carrying one another. Consequences rarely arrive with noise. They do not knock on the door or announce themselves. They simply begin replacing assumptions with facts. That is how the final chapter of our family's story unfolded. Not through arguments, not through courtrooms, not through dramatic confrontations, through records, through deadlines, through the quiet certainty of systems that treated everyone exactly the same. Over the following months, I settled into a life that felt unfamiliar at first, but gradually became peaceful. My apartment remained small. The furniture did not match. The balcony overlooked a parking lot instead of a backyard. Yet every evening, when I locked the door behind me, I felt something I had not experienced in a long time. I felt welcome in my own home. There was no tension waiting in the hallway, no careful effort to avoid saying the wrong thing, no wondering whether my presence had become inconvenient. Silence had become comforting again. One afternoon, my sister came to visit. She had heard fragments of what had happened, but had never pressed me for details. We drank tea by the window. She looked around my apartment before speaking. "You seem calmer." "I am. I wish things had turned out differently." "So do I," she hesitated. "People have been asking questions. I expected they would. They're beginning to understand that the situation wasn't what they were told." I nodded without satisfaction. Truth has a way of traveling slowly. It rarely arrives all at once. It reaches one person, then another, until eventually it no longer needs anyone to defend it. A few weeks later, my nephew called. He worked in finance and had always admired careful planning. He spoke gently. "I didn't know you were covering so many expenses. I never talked about it." "No, you didn't." There was a pause. "A lot of people assume something very different." "I know," he sighed. "I think they're embarrassed." Embarrassment is an unusual emotion. Unlike anger, it cannot easily be blamed on someone else. It asks difficult questions. What did I fail to notice? What did I choose to believe because it was easier? What responsibility did I quietly hand to another person without acknowledging it? Those questions had finally reached my extended family, not because I had asked them to, because reality had reached them first. My son called less often after our meeting at the diner. When he did, the conversations changed. He no longer asked whether I could restart the transfers. He no longer spoke about temporary setbacks. Instead, he asked ordinary questions. How was my health? Had I found a good doctor near the apartment? Were the grandchildren allowed to visit? They were small conversations, careful conversations. Perhaps that was the beginning of honesty. One Saturday afternoon, there was a knock at my door. It was my oldest grandson. My son stood a few steps behind him. "I wanted to show you something," my grandson said excitedly. He held out a school project. It was a family tree. He pointed to my name. "I made sure you were right here." He tapped the page with quiet pride, not off to the side, not separated, connected, exactly where I had always been. Children often repair what adults damage without realizing they are doing it. My son watched silently. After my grandson wandered toward the balcony to look outside, my son spoke. "I've been thinking about something." I waited. "You always paid the bills without mentioning them." "Yes. I always assumed there would be another payment next month." "I know. I never stopped to ask what it cost you." I looked at him for a long moment. "It wasn't the money that cost me." He lowered his eyes. This time he understood. The greatest debt between us had never appeared on a bank statement. It had been measured in trust. When they left that afternoon, my grandson hugged me tightly. "I'll come back soon. I'll be here." And I meant it. Not because I expected everything to return to what it had been, because I had finally stopped waiting for the past to rescue the present. Months later, I reviewed my finances one quiet morning. The recurring transfers were gone. My savings had begun growing again, not dramatically, steadily, the same way they once disappeared each month. The numbers mattered less than what they represented. Choice. For the first time in years, every dollar leaving my account did so because I had freely decided it should. Not because silence had become expectation. I closed the statement and placed it inside the same folder that had once held years of automatic payment records. I kept it, not as evidence against my family, but as a reminder to myself. Generosity should never require applause, but neither should it require invisibility. There is a difference between giving freely and allowing your kindness to be rewritten as obligation. I learned that difference too late to save the home I thought I still had, but not too late to save the dignity I still possessed. Looking back, I do not remember the text message first. I do not remember the packed boxes. I do not even remember canceling the direct deposits. I remember something much quieter. The moment I realized that truth does not always need a witness willing to speak. Sometimes it only needs time, because time has a remarkable habit of uncovering what silence has protected. And when it finally does, Consequences arrive without anger, without celebration, and without asking anyone's permission. They simply become the part of the story no one can deny.